Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be the first of a new series of videos. I'm doing a lot of series at the moment. I've been toying with the idea of discussing some of the musical train wrecks that have happened in the history of rock and roll. Often we celebrate the wonderful things that happen in the industry, the wonderful gigs, albums, all sorts of different things that happen, but also sometimes the fates aren't with the musicians, are they? And sometimes they go wrong, don't they? And on this video, the first train wreck we're going to be discussing is going to be Led Zeppelin at Live Aid. Now, this is not going to be a hatchet job against Led Zeppelin, because I love Led Zeppelin. And just for those of you who don't know, I was actually Robert Plant's drummer for 3 or 4 years, many years ago. And I think I got a little bit of an insight inside the workings of the Led Zeppelin machine. And working with Robert as I did, I think I've got something to add on my opinion of what actually happened on that gig. Because, let us say, it did not do the Led Zeppelin reputation that much good, did it? And I'm going to defend them for it and try and explain what I think happened. But of course, this is only my opinion. It isn't the opinion of anyone in Led Zeppelin. It's not the opinion of anybody involved. It's just this, YouTubers stuck up in the corner of YouTube pontificating on what I think happened. Now, Led Zeppelin called it a day in 1980. This was motivated by the death of their drummer, John Bonham. John Bonham, of course, is one of the most iconic drummers in rock history. And after much thought, they realised that John was irreplaceable. And that was a good move. That was correct. Certain musicians in certain bands are essential for them to be that band. They're not that band. The band's name is a name that points to certain musicians, and they have to be there. It's quite interesting how this happens. And I think with Led Zeppelin, in the same way as Rush is not Rush without Neil Peart, Led Zeppelin can't really be Led Zeppelin without John Bonham. If I put a Led Zeppelin album on, I'm listening to John Bonham. So I think they called it right. They called it a day, and that was it. And at that point, an interesting thing happened. These guys were still only in their early to mid-30s. They're multi-millionaires. Their albums are going to carry on being sold. They're going to be set up for life. They can do whatever they want to do. They all sorts of do solo careers of varying success. John Paul Jones is quite happy to blast out a solo album every now and then. His greatest probably being the one he made with Diamond de Galles, which is totally out there. And only a member of Led Zeppelin would get away with putting an album out like that. That's a very experimental album. Jimmy Page does his best. He forms a band called The Firm. They don't quite get off the ground. Then he does his Outrider album. It's good. You've got Jason Bonham on drums. It's great, Works with David Coverdale, as certain people call him, David Coverversion. And we get this sort of pseudo ersatz Led Zeppelin album. But very quickly, you see that Jimmy Page really, I think his great statement was made in Led Zeppelin. And as time goes on, he becomes the great keeper of the Led Zeppelin lore, L-O-R-E, lore. And he has been the guy that has overseen the remasters of the album, repackaging them out, bringing the extra footage out, working on the DVD. He's been the guy behind that, which was originally motivated by the fact that the record companies brought out these famous Led Zeppelin albums on CD, and they were terrible. And Jimmy Page thought, I'm going to do that. And so I think Jimmy's mind has been on the past. He looks after the flame. John Paul Jones is off doing whatever he wants to do, bits of film soundtrack. He's off doing that. Robert Plant, however, he has a musical career of his own, right? He sells millions and millions of records. He has hit records. So when we look at 1985, right, these things haven't quite been delineated yet. And I think this is part of the problem. Nobody knew quite what to do. I think if you go to the Led Zepp guys now and ask them a proposition of doing something, they would be able to make that decision a lot better. But that's the first thing you have to realise is Jimmy Page has got his solo career, but that's not going to happen. Robert's got his solo career and he's heading for doing success after success. And, you know, the recent albums he's done, like Raising Sand, that won Grammys and sold millions, he's been able to keep his career going. But he made a couple of albums at this point. So in a way, it was too close to the demise. This is the first thing. If they'd have been asked to come together under less than, you know, perfect circumstances 20 years later, I think the hype of them just standing on stage together would have carried it through. There's been a big announcement that Black Sabbath will be coming back together to play in Birmingham. You know, this year everyone's coming to pay homage to the greatest heavy metal band of all time. And I feel like if they get on stage and they're a little bit subpar, but you see Bill Ward, Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne on stage together for the last time, that will be enough. I will give them a round of applause. I will, you know, if I could go there, bloody tickets expensive though. But if I was there, I would pay homage to that band. And I don't care, but Led Zeppelin were in that position. These are still young guys. And also, the Led Zeppelin myth hadn't quite happened. Led Zeppelin at that point were a slightly untrendy band from the 1970s. They hadn't taken on the sort of almost sort of religious aspect of being legends back then. I can remember this is the case. I can remember you didn't really want to admit to liking Led Zeppelin in the middle of the 1980s because you really need to like Sisters of Mercy or, you know, The Cure. You weren't going to be championing. I was a massive fan of them. I know this because I was at school and I was into Led Zeppelin and nobody was really interested. And it's like if you'd have gone in and said to anybody at that time, oh, go and listen to this song or that song, they wouldn't have known them and they wouldn't have been interested. So I got a tickle in my nose. I might sneeze at some point. If I do, I will. I'm not going to edit them out. We're just going to keep going. So I think that's the context. So obviously, Bob Geldof releases Band-Aid in the UK, trying to raise money. It's a noble cause. You've got to be involved. You know, it's like you don't want to be seen as being the bad guys. And then there's this idea of doing the biggest gig in history. One gig in the UK and another gig in America. And it's going to be huge, right? There's this big thing, Live Aid. It's going to raise money. Now, what's interesting is, straight off, the books, the acts that they book are really coming from that sort of mainstream rock world. So we remember the U2 playing, we remember Queen playing, but Michael Jackson's not there, Prince isn't there, right? So there's this idea that this is a rock gig. Now, if you're going to do a rock gig, there's this thought, well, who else could we get? What about The Who? Could we get The Who? What about the Rolling Stones? You know, and you start to go through those bands, would the Beatles reform and do it? And this idea emerges that, you know, maybe Led Zeppelin could do it. Now, the decision process that made Jimmy and Robert agree to do it, I wish I could illuminate more, because I'm baffled that they actually agreed to do it. I cannot see what was in it for them. So the only thing I could assume is that both the guys really believed in the cause. They really believed in what Bob Geldof was trying to do, and they realised that putting the Led Zeppelin name to it, that's one of those, that's like the big announcement. That's all. And the thing is that when you've got everybody in the world playing, right, every single band playing, and yet Led Zeppelin coming back together, it becomes newsworthy. And maybe this is what it was, is that Led Zeppelin, who were sagging at that point a little bit, maybe it was a way of getting the name back in. Maybe, you know, they said, well, we could do this gig, and because we see it now of thinking, oh, Led Zeppelin do a gig now and you're going to have a million people crashing the ticket board if they announce it. I don't know if that was the case then. So I don't know whether they did it thinking, oh, you know, this will get the Led Zeppelin brand back in people's faces, so young people might see it. That's not a bad idea. And I imagine it may have been, on top of the altruistic, you know, we're going to save all the starving Africans, you know, on top of that, I can see that the utility of doing it from that point of view. Now, the reason why I think they did the American one and not the British one when they were British people, is because they were in America. Robert is in America already because he's doing a solo tour. So Robert's on tour. They're not going to be able to rehearse that much, and they haven't got a band to rehearse because John Bonham's no longer with us. So what drummer are they going to use? Now, the choice is Tony Thompson. Now, Tony Thompson is one of my favourite drummers, and he is was an incredible drummer. He came to fame drumming for Chic. Tony Thompson comes from the world of black music, from soul and R&B. He is that type of drummer. In the 1980s, after playing with Chic, there was this re-emergence, and Nile Rodgers gets pulled into, produce David Bowie's album, and there's been a continual resurgence of Chic and that production. It's still going on. Daft Punk did it recently. And so Tony Thompson is a really interesting choice to drum for Led Zeppelin because he doesn't come with that rock baggage. If you were to go and get another rock drummer, you would be going, oh, the drummer from so-and-so, they got Brian Downey from Thin Lizzy, or, oh, they got Ian Pace. And it's almost like the rock audience don't know who this guy is, but he's a heavyweight. That's how I saw it. Now, in the early 80s, Duran Duran had another band from the West Midlands, from Birmingham. They decided to take some time off, and Nick Rhodes and Simon Le Bon went off and did a very airy-fairy sort of electronica English thing called Arcadia, which was great because it was all full of English whimsy, Arcadia. Whereas John Taylor and Andy Taylor, they went off and did Power Station, and Power Station teamed them up with Robert Palmer, and it was basically Blue Eyed Soul, and it's brilliant. And the production on that Power Station album is incredible. And Tony Thompson, who has been seen as a very tight, funky drummer, drumming on things like Freak Out or Car Wash or whatever he played on, because he played on other funky disco records. He comes in with this huge sound, this real huge sound. It's like he's channeling John Bonham. And so Tony Thompson is a great choice. So he gets pulled in. There's this discussion, shall we get Tony? Now, I think part of the problem with Tony Thompson is because those guys, they don't necessarily grow up listening to Led Zeppelin like I have. They're listening to people like Bernard Purdie. It's a different cultural background. I'm ready to go on any Led Zeppelin song now. I'm going to play any one because I've been listening to them. I listen to Led Zeppelin every single month, and I have done for the last 45 years. I mean, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. If Tony Thompson had been ready to go, he wouldn't have made the mistakes he made, but he wasn't too sure of how these went on. Now, he's learnt the stuff, right? He's learnt the stuff, but that's the anomaly with Tony Thompson, right? John Paul Jones, they haven't asked him. And so this idea that Jimmy and Robert are going to get up. Now, this did happen later on when Jimmy and Robert got together to do the sort of no quarter acoustic unleaded thing. And then they made another album, which is Walking into Clarksdale, which is strange because this is like the last studio album of Led Zeppelin, or at least half of Led Zeppelin. Nobody ever talks about Walking into Clarksdale. It was produced by that guy in Nirvana, the guy that what's his name, Butch Vig or whatever it is. Can't remember his name. What's the bloke who? Anyway, it was produced, and I think that's part of the problem with the production. It's really interesting, creative. I might go back and reevaluate. I do want to. I mean, the unleaded thing was a big thing, and everyone went on about that, and it was all over the MTV, and we all watched it. But the Walking into Clarksdale album was a big thing at the time. I went and bought it the day it came out, but no one mentions it now. You would have thought people would talk about it. It had hits on it and everything. Anyway, so I think there's this idea that Jimmy and Robert may have wanted to work together, and Jimmy's popping up on Robert's albums every now and then, and he's turning up at gigs. So they want to work together, I think. John Paul Jones is out of the loop. John Paul Jones hears about it, and he has to sort of invite himself on. So now we have another anomaly here, is that John Paul Jones is like going, well, am I doing it? Yeah, I suppose. You want to do it? Yeah, I'll do it then. And so there's no rehearsal. Tony Thompson probably might not know the stuff like we would know the stuff, those rock guys. You've got John Paul Jones sort of inviting himself onto the thing. And then you've got the fact that throughout Led Zeppelin's later years, Jimmy Page was suffering with substance issues. I think when John Bonham died, that was a shock because everybody thought it would be Jimmy would be the one who died. If you look at him in the late 70s, he does not look like a well man. And I think the only food he had at that point was like banana daiquiris. That was the only thing that was nutritious that he was eating. And I don't think that was solved when Led Zeppelin stopped and John Bonham stopped. And I think the reason why Jimmy's career didn't get off the ground, perhaps, is because that sort of abuse carried on and he wasn't quite with it. And I think he turned up in a certain place, let us say. I'm not saying he was off his head on the gig, but I think there was a certain influence on Jimmy, maybe. But Robert's going to be fine. I mean, Robert can turn up, greatest frontman of all time, turn up and do it. Problem with Robert is he's on tour. Now, when you're on tour and you sing like Robert Plant, your voice can go. Now, when they turned up to do this gig at Live Aid, Robert's voice had been really hammered on that tour. Okay? He's singing and he does pull it off, I think, but he's not 100%. Then we have the spanner in the works, known as Phil Collins. Now, if you expect me to say it was all Phil Collins' fault, I don't actually think it was. If you go back to Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis and listen to the track Fly on the Windshield, you will hear a great big John Bonham-esque drum beat coming in. And the reason for that is that by the time they got to that album, Phil Collins had two big influences at that point, Billy Cobham and John Bonham, right? There is no way Phil Collins does not know those tracks. He knows those tracks, okay? When Robert launched his solo career in the early 80s, he pulled in Cozy Powell, but also Phil Collins. And I know that the reason that Robert pulled Phil Collins in was because he could do the job. When I was very, very young and I'd just become a Led Zeppelin fan, we had a TV program in the UK called The Tube. And they announced that Robert Plant would be playing. And I got very excited. And I was sat there, came home from school, and I got my two fingers ready. I got these two fingers ready there like that. And they're on the play and the record, and I'm ready to go. And the tube starts, and I hit record. And Jules Holland comes out and says that Robert's not going to be doing it. And I was disappointed. And they put up a photograph that was tinted blue of Led Zeppelin on stage and played the live version of Stairway to Heaven. And that wasn't enough. That did not give me that what I wanted is a huge Led Zeppelin. I was greatly upset. So years later, I'm with Robert and I tell him about how much he upset me that day, you know, and I haven't got over it. And he told me what happened. Now, what happened was that they were in rehearsals and it wasn't good enough. They were working with a very, very famous drummer and the drummer hadn't quite nailed it. Now, why hadn't they nailed it? I'll tell you why, because Led Zeppelin's bloody hard. John Bonham's a hard one to cover. And not just technically, it's not technically, it's feel-wise. And it's the way that John Bonham plays. And the improvisational aspect, you can't learn the stuff note for note because Led Zeppelin don't play like that. I won't say who this drummer was. And so that did not work. And so Robert called up Phil Collins, and when they went into the studio, rather than being the drummer that I am thinking of, that I'm not going to tell you who it is, it was Phil Collins, and he nailed it. Now, the reason why Phil Collins nailed it is because Phil Collins is like, or was, one of the greatest classic rock drummers in history. He's like, he can play anything, and it annoys me so much that you talk about underrated drummers, it's Phil Collins. And it's like, Anybody who's heard Brand X, they know what he can do. So there's no way Phil can't do it. But Phil Collins takes a lot on his plate, doesn't he? Because he decides to play at both gigs. So he's going to play at the British gig, come out on his piano, sing All Against the Odds or whatever it is. Then he's going to jump on Concorde and he's going to fly across land, go over to Shea Stadium or wherever it was, and he's going to then do a set there and also be a part of the reformation of the greatest rock band that's ever been. It's a bit much, isn't it? Phil, what have you got on today? Oh, busy day today, mate. Busy day, yeah. I was thinking of playing Live Aid, the greatest, biggest gig in the history of Britain. Then getting on Concorde, trying to get over to America, and then I'm going to do the same gig over there, the biggest gig in the history of the world. And I'm going to drum for Led Zeppelin, who are going to reform, and the whole world's going to be looking at them. And it's not going to just be me on drums. Now, here is the big problem, right? Is two drummers. I've played in a band with two drummers, right? When you play in a band with two drummers, you can't get out there and jam. It's like you've got one guy building a shed, you've got another guy building a shed. If you got listening to one guy build a shed whilst someone else is trying to build a shed, it's two people trying to build a shed. And that was the big problem, is that drummers are like ringmasters. Drummers can control stuff. When things get cocked up, you can cue it back in, you can move it back out, you can always slow it down or speed it back up, or we miss that cue or we come around again. And the drummers can drive it. That's what a drummer does. They're like the conductor of the band. And both of those drummers would have been capable of doing it. But what I think happened is that I think Tony Thompson didn't quite know the stuff. I think Phil Collins actually did. But he was having to try and direct it. And because he knew the stuff, he was trying to direct it. And so it looks like Phil is cueing them down wrong alleys and trying to solve this stuff. The two drummer thing was a bad idea. On top of this, Jimmy Page is a little bit out of it, a little bit sloppy, but we all know that, Led Zeppelin had gone across the whole of the States 100 times. And many of those gigs Jimmy Page had been sloppy on. Many people have approached me on this channel and said, I saw Led Zeppelin in 1975 and they were terrible. And, Jimmy Page was just swinging out of a Jack Daniels bottle all night and just wasn't, he wasn't with it whatsoever. It's terrible. Then John Bonham. So there's the myth that Led Zeppelin are the greatest rock band and they can just get up is not the case. Jimmy's a bit sloppy. And then Robert is struggling a little bit and it's not his fault. All those things, right, are what makes that the gig that it is. Now, if it had been a wedding or they were in some working man's club and they all happened to be in the room together and they say, get up and play, it would have been the best gig in the world. If you were there watching that, it would have been the best gig in the world. But in the context of it, right, with Led Zeppelin coming back as they did and not being seen as the hallowed, close to God, Mount Olympus band that they are, and the fact that there was a certain sneeriness towards these classic dinosaur rock bands at that time in 1985, it was the peak of that. I think the perception of it was a bit wobbly. Now, I can remember watching it at the time and not so much thinking that. Led Zeppelin got on stage, they played the stuff. It was a bit wobbly, but I didn't really notice that. I just was happy to see my favourite band on stage together. I was happy to see them all. It was interesting to see, because the other thing is Led Zeppelin is Robert Plant, with the long hair, and he's got the shirt open and a big bulge. And then Jimmy Page's got the dragon trousers and he's conducting everything like this. John Bonham's got the big headband on. That's what you imagine. And what we had was 80s Led Zeppelin. When they got back together and did the tribute to Ahmet Erkgan, the Celebration Day thing, which really, I believe, made up for the Live Aid gig. They looked more, because it was around about that, closer to post-grunge they look the part, but they don't look the part. No rock band looked any good in the 1980s. So I'm really going to posit the blame on the 1980s. I think that's the thing. And there's so much we can blame the 1980s for. And so those of you who expected a rant, you're going to get a rant, but you're not going to get a rant against Led Zeppelin because I love them so much. Led Zeppelin were a bloody victim of the 1980s. And the 1980s was the worst decade for everything that you could ever have. And the thing that makes me really angry, is the fact that we have some sort of nostalgia for the 1980s. We have a nostalgia for it now. And people look back to these artists and, you know, my wife, she gets up every bloody morning. She goes into the kitchen and puts the telly on and then walks out there and she finds this sort of nostalgia channel. And all it's full of is really low quality because when they made these bloody videos, because it's the videos bloody made it all go wrong. Wasn't it all? It's like 1980s come along, MTV comes along, everyone hates rock music. Eric Clapton's making albums with no guitar on it. You know, nobody wants to know about guitar. They don't want to know about real drums. Everything's cool. Record companies going, put a drum machine on it. Put a DX7 on it, you know. Get yourself a mullet. Everything. And the thing is, we're 40 years down the line. This is, look, in the late 80s, early 90s, we had a bloody hit record here. What was it called? I got the hearts for you, bum ba dum bum ba da bum ba. I got the hearts for. And then Delight came out with do 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 do, and they came out and Bootsy came out. Do you remember that? Who was that one? Delight. Grooves in the Heart. I remember that coming out early 90s, maybe late 80s, early 90s. So that was basically channeling the early 70s. So 70s, 80s. That's 20 years. That's 20 years. Okay, right. And when Bootsy came back, I said, oh yeah, Bootsy's actually quite cool. Because Bootsy wasn't cool anybody who was cool was not cool in the 1980s, were they? It just, everybody, George Clinton, I mean, James Brown, I mean, he had that bloody Living in America. I mean, he went from making Cold Sweat to Living in America. It's like a bloody boxing theme. It's like Rocky theme, isn't it? Was it on Rocky? I don't know. Getting confused because I try to cover it all up. But the point is, the 1980s were terrible, right? In every shape or form. And I'm going to tell you why it was so terrible. It was because everybody wanted to rebel against what had gone before. That rock and roll had brought out this idea of rebellion. You know, you got Little Richard, you know, good God, it's Molly, you know, was he a man or a woman? I can't tell. You know, and all that bit. And then you got the Beatles coming out with their bit long hair, shaking it and singing, you know, she's a day tripper, you know, one-way ticket. Yeah, what are they singing about? It seems a bit dodgy to me. Then the Stones come out and they're juggies. And it's all about rebellion, isn't it? And when the punks come out, the punks in the 1970s, they understand where the rebellion lies. It's with rock music. But for some reason, in the 1980s, they turn on rock music. And I've got to be honest, it's never really gone back. That's the big crime in the 1980s. If you wanted to get through the 1980s as a guitar band, you had to do everything that guitar bands wouldn't do, right? Which means you had to sit there with your guitar, right? And look mournful, right? Like, right, now I'm a bit of a jazz fusion guy, as you can tell. So I've got my guitar up high. You can see this isn't really high because I want to be able to do all that stuff, right? But this is not cool. A rock guitarist, they have the guitar down there. But in the 80s, they have to do the opposite. They put it up there. But none of these guys could do jazz fusion licks. You know, they're just going like... And then they do this thing, and you look at the floor, you strum away. And then you swing like that. You imagine that you've got the news, oh, don't go down that path. You know what happens to your channel when you always bloody bring your suicide. But this thing here of doing this, we're gonna pretend to be velvet underground. I got the bigger dark sunglasses. I'm going to eat some molasses, and now I'll put it in my hair. Then I'll sit down on a chair because I don't like standing up. because it wears me out and I've got no energy. That's basically, if you're doing guitar music, and I played guitar in the 1980s. I played guitar. So if you play guitar, you're having to listen to hair metal bands. Right, now let's be honest. Winger and Poison were not Led Zeppelin, were they? Even Kingdom Come was not Led Zeppelin. The 1980s ruined rock music. If you were going to be cool, you couldn't like rock music. And that went out on things. You couldn't like flared trousers. You couldn't like the funk. Everything that was cool was undone in the 1980s. And why was that? Because the 1980s is about capitalism. It's about Wall Street. It's about, here in the UK, it was all like, shirts with braces on, loads of money. That's what the 1980s was. An awful decade. And Led Zeppelin should have realised this and hibernated like a rock bear in a cave. They should have just shut up shop and gone into their big cave and not tried, because he's like Robert Plant. He's tried everything throughout the 1980s. He's got to be honest. That's the thing. He starts off all right, but then he's bringing in dance music and sampling, and he's doing this and he's doing that, And I can remember I was watching MTV, and he comes out and he's got the big mullet because he wants to have the long hair, but he should have had his hair cut short. But he can't have his hair cut short because he's Robert Plant. And he's eating like a chocolate eclair. Can you remember what that was? That Tall Cool one? Remember that video? He was eating the chocolate eclair, and I thought, I don't like this. I don't like it at all. This is not Robert Plant for me. He gets his act together. Once the 80s are over, they all get their act together, don't they? But the worst of it is, me, was growing up in the 1980s. So I was walking around with my hair pretty long, and I got as you can see, I got quite tight hair, and it does what it wants to do. Before I came here, I tried to make it go forward just to have a bit of a different hairstyle. And I wet it and I pushed it down like this. It just wants to do what it wants. So my hair, when it was long, it did go into sort of matted dreadlocks a little bit towards the end. So I was a bit scrodgy. It's the only word I can describe it as. A bit of wispy beard, flares. I borrowed on stars onto my flares, cowboy boots, white flowy shirt. I really, I saw myself as somewhere between, I don't know, Raquel Welch and Jim Morrison. That was what I was going for in the 1980s, which was at odds with what was actually happening in my school and with my friends around me, who were basically, drawing the Cure onto their pencil cases while they had these great big long black coats. Like that film. What was that film? The Long Riders. Remember that film came out? And they'd all got the long coats, and then they used to crimp their hair and do it into this sort of triangle shape like this, all spiky like that. And I can remember they couldn't go out in the rain because the hairstyle was just designed to catch the rain and then take in the moisture, and then they just went into this floppy mass. They couldn't be windswept and interesting. You couldn't have goths at Woodstock. They would not have looked good. They would have looked like some sodden pandas. I'm not swearing. I'm not saying sodding pansies like you thought I was saying. I thought I was saying it for a few seconds then, but I wasn't. Sodden pandas. That's what they would have looked like if you had a goths at Woodstock. Where am I really going with this? I'm trying to add a little bit of entertainment into this video. I'm not going to knock Led Zeppelin. My central point is sound. My central point is sound. It was the 80s that ruined Led Zeppelin at Live Aid. And Live Aid, as we know, was the beginning of the end of rock music. It's the apex of the 1980s. And it's where all the rock bands went from being just some kids who were playing guitars and blowing you away with their psychedelic ways, and it turned them all into these very earnest, moral superstars that want to save the world. It's all Earth Song, Michael Jackson. It all goes down towards that, doesn't it? And they've all got to prove that they're decent people. None of them are decent people. They weren't then, and they aren't now. You know, if you get a teenage boy and stick him in a rock band and he can do what he wants, he will do whatever he wants. And a bit like that king that was in France. Which was it? He's a British king as well. He was from France. Was it Richard III? One of the kings. He could just do whatever he wants. He was a young lad. He got himself a horse, and he'd go out and he'd just do whatever he wanted. He wanted to kill someone, he'd go and kill someone. If he wanted to rape someone, he would rape someone. That's what he did. That's what our rock stars were in the 70s. That's why they dressed like that. That's why they had all the frilly bits on here. They all saw themselves as in the court of rock, going around causing all sorts of trouble. Whatever they wanted to do, they would do. And then the 80s come along, and when they were pretending to be earnest and moral, it was a joke. They weren't earnest and moral. None of them were. Well, maybe you two were. I think Bono probably was. He wouldn't have had any messing, would he? I mean, Bono's and Sting. Sting was pretty moral, wasn't he? You know, because he was off with that, you know, that bloke from the jungle with the CD in his mouth. Remember all that going on? They were all doing all that in the 1980s. Bloody awful. Absolutely awful. I mean, what did the Rolling Stones do throughout the 1980s? I'll tell you what they did. They just did exactly what they'd always done. They just sat it through. They sat it through, didn't they? Never made a decent album. They didn't need to. They just go out on tour, do their old thing, you know, do their thing. They didn't try. That's I've got to give them respect for that. And Led Zeppelin are the same. Led Zeppelin are not the band to be saving Africans, right? They're just not the right band to be doing it. No. Right? I know it's the right thing to do, but not for Led Zeppelin to do that. Led Zeppelin should not be doing that. They should be going across America with samurai swords, destroying everything in their path. That's what they should be doing. Taking every substance known to man, and anybody stopping in their way, getting their crew to tell them not to. With big Peter Grant, with his big fat stomach, bopping everybody out the way that gets to that, get out of it, you, and get out of it, you, all the way across America. That's what I want from my Led Zeppelin. Not saving the Africans. I don't want them doing that. I don't want it. That's not what I want Led Zeppelin to be doing. I want them to be the immoral princes that they are. I know they're old now. You know, they're old now, and they're like old gentlemen, and they should now be behaving as only old English gentlemen should, and I believe they are. You know, wearing tweed, walking out into the forest with your dog and your walking stick, and prodding about things and looking at them. That's what I expect from my rock stars. I expect them to go from the princely, immoral, you know, totalitarian nutters to the quintessential English gentleman having to prod around in a bush with his stick, you know, having a bit of a rustle, having a mooch. That's what Englishmen do. Where's my bloody hat? I don't wear this for no reason. I don't just put it on to look like an idiot. No, I put it on because it's the hat of the Englishman. You see? It doesn't really go with his coat of mine, but does it? But I'm ready for weather. An Englishman's always ready for weather. There we go. It's not. I'm not getting the English aesthetic of it. Look at these two over here. Proper musicians. They wouldn't have cocked up. These two guys would not have cocked up at Live Aid. They were never going to cock up. These are proper musicians here. This is Wes Montgomery and Milt Jackson. That one's Wes Montgomery there, and that's Milt Jackson. And they actually dress like proper English gentlemen, because they are. In my book, these two are English gentlemen, and they are. And they deserve our respect. That's a proper musician here, for all of you Led Zeppelin fans. You want to know the greatest guitarist in the last 50, 60 years? It's that man there. And Milt, he had a nickname, Bags. Bags meets Wes. They called him Bags. He's got a nickname, Bags. Bloody brilliant. That's how people should dress when they get a bit older, shouldn't they? I'll stick them up there so they're in the background. I think I'm done now. I managed to do an extra 10 minutes on this, of real nonsense rubbish. But there's a few laughs in there. I hope you've enjoyed this. We're done now, aren't we? Yeah, I'm not going to do any editing. This is going to go up raw, so I've got to say anything because So, as I always say at the end of a video, if you like this video, like it. If you want to see some more, subscribe. If you want to support me, there's a whole bunch of links down below there. And you can click on them. But you're not just supporting me by clicking on. There might be something of interest. Go and have a mooch. Like an English gentleman, get your old stick out and have a prod round my bushes and see what's there. You might find a treat. You might find something, I don't know, Alistair MacLean paperback stuck down there. That's not too damn. I'll read that later on, put it on the side. Where Eagles Dare. It's in the film, I'll read the book. That's what I'm going to do this afternoon. You know, England has a history of great literature, and I should, you know, be sampling it, as only a good English gentleman can. Remember this is what Led Zeppelin are. They're good English gentlemen. They're good English, they have had their wild ways when they're younger, but they need to be respected for this. So if you want to see lots of different content, there's loads of links down there. I've got a Patreon. You can become a free member of my Patreon, or a paid up member. You could, what else do? I've got Substack. I've got podcasts on there. You can go over, if I haven't got a link to it, if you go over to Spotify and search Andy Edwards podcasts, you can, you know, if you're out, you know, in the forest, you know, prodding, as you do, that's an English pastime. I'm not on about dogging. I'm not on about that. That's another English pastime, which I will be covering on a later video. I won't be really, but because I've just realised if I say that, certain people go, oh, Andy, I'll be waiting for that one. Right? But no, if you're out prodding and you've got your little ear pods like they have now in the future, you can put on one of my podcasts and have a listen to me on there if you want more of me. Anyway, all the links are down below. I've got a PayPal tip jar as well, and you could give me a little bit of money. Or you could press the button on this video, which is, I believe, is there. It's there. Press that one and give us a bit of dosh. I think I'm done now on this one, aren't I? Led Zeppelin, the train wreck that was Led Zeppelin at Live Aid. Not their fault, bloody the 1980s fault. That's the conclusion. I'm right. What do you think? Put it in the comments. See you on the next video. Bye-bye.